Welcome to part 4 of the video series on ethics and professional practice. Let's first do a recap of some of the things we talked earlier. We talked about these 6 canons of professional ethics set forth by NSPE. We also talked about rules of practice for engineering based on these 6 canons, but we didn't elaborate too much on these rules. And then we touched upon professional obligations of engineer, which is a part of code of ethics adopted by NSPE. If you want to take a good look at the full document, you can find it here in this link provided. And another important topic we covered earlier is the hierarchy obligations of the engineer, which range from society and the public at the top priority and the engineer himself as the last priority. You may also recall that this more or less is like an inverted pyramid where most good happens to most people for the top priority, which is the society and the public. Another thing we mentioned when we were comparing law and ethics is that ethics offers guidelines on conduct. And all those things we talked about earlier, these rules, the obligations lead to a set of rules and guidelines, which is exactly going to be the focus of this video. Rules and conduct guidelines. With regards to engineer himself, general conduct, suppliers, clients and employees, other engineers and the profession, and the public. Before we proceed any further, we want to distinguish between rules and guidelines. Wherever we mention shall or shall not, that is pretty much the operative word for rules, and the rest of them are going to be guidelines. All engineers must adhere to the rules or face the risk of losing the license. Let's first start with the engineer's obligation to self. Engineering is not a static discipline. Technology keeps evolving, tools of the trade constantly keep on changing, and therefore engineers must keep their skills at the state-of-the-art level all the time, and therefore continuing education is essential. Another way to put it is lifelong learning is part of engineering practice. Nowadays, with so much material available using internet so quickly, it's becoming almost impossible to trace the original source of any material you find on the web. As engineers, it is obligatory for us to provide proper attribution to the help received, be it literature, designs, inventions, and other accomplishments. No exceptions. What would be your obligation as a citizen if you witness a crime? You would report it to the police or proper authorities, correct? But if you are an engineer and you notice something that endangers public safety, it is obligatory for you, whether you are involved in that particular work or not, it is obligatory. Actually, it is mandatory that you shall notify proper authorities when a decision adversely affecting public safety and welfare is made, whether you are a part of that particular work or not. This is an obligation to self as well as an obligation to the client or employer, which you will see later on. Now let's talk about some of the rules and guidelines for general conduct by all engineers. The rules are going to be with respect to deceptive acts, questionable acts, gifts, and conflicts of interest. Let's first talk about deceptive acts by engineer himself or herself. An engineer shall not falsify his or her own qualifications, permit misrepresentation of an associate's qualification, misrepresent or exaggerate responsibilities and credits on prior assignment. As you can see from the wording, these are rules as dictated by this operative word shall not. So this will be a set of rules. Okay, it's one thing for you not to do deceptive acts. You also should be preventing others from doing deceptive acts in your name. For example, an engineer shall not permit the use of his or her name, associate his name in business ventures, aid or abet the unlawful practice of engineering by any person or firm who, in his or her belief, is engaged in fraudulent or dishonest enterprise. Questionable practices are also deceptive acts, but I chose to call them questionable practices in deference to my original source of these bullet points by Mr. Thomas Ganiran Jr. So one of the questionable practices is trimming, which is to smooth of irregularities to make data look extremely accurate and precise. Cooking is another questionable practice which retains only those results that fit the theory and disregard others. And then there is this outright manufacturing of data which doesn't exist. It's like inventing some or all of the research data. As a professor, I cannot emphasize enough on how serious the problem of plagiarism is, or outright stealing. It includes improper or lack of attribution to the source. Don't do that. And then there is this conflict of interest, which is essentially personally benefiting from official or professional actions. There are four types of conflicts of interest. The first one is actual conflict of interest, in which engineer directly personally benefits from his official actions. Potential conflict of interest means that there exists a potential to abuse the system, but that doesn't mean that abuse has happened. There is an apparent conflict of interest, means it's clearly obvious. And the fourth one is the appearance of conflict of interest. The appearance means that it looks bad from outside, but clearly no conflict of interest activity has taken place. The four sources of conflict of interest are with regards to clients and employees, suppliers, other engineers, and the public. So how do you deal with conflicts of interest? The most preferred way is to completely avoid conflict of interest. Sometimes it is not possible to avoid one of the four types of conflicts of interest. For example, an engineer's spouse is working at a client site, but in a capacity that is not necessarily going to have any influence of client awarding the contract to the engineers or engineer's firm. But in a situation like that, what would you do? Both the spouse and the engineer should be providing some sort of a disclosure, and do a full disclosure. That is, the rule governing that conflict of interest is engineers shall disclose all known or potential conflicts of interest that could influence or appear to influence their judgment or the quality of their services. In the example we are talking about, if such a disclosure is made that the spouse is working at the client's site and the engineer or the engineer firm is bidding on a contract, for example, it's possible for the client to take measures so that spouse cannot play any role in making decisions related to awarding the contract. So that's how conflict of interest can be avoided. More specifically, that's how disclosure can be effectively used to avoid any conflict of interest. Gifts. In some respects, gifts are small bribes. Many agencies have strict rules regarding gifts and whether they can take them, if they can take them, what is the limit of the value of the gifts, etc., etc. So the NSPE Code of Ethics specifically prohibits engineers from taking gifts, and the language goes like something like this: engineers shall not offer, give, solicit, or receive any contribution, monetary or otherwise, to influence the award of a contract, or pay commission, percentage, or brokerage fee to secure work except to bona fide employee, bona fide established agencies retained by the employer. The language is very clear. Now let's talk about how to deal with suppliers. Suppliers are your partners, they're not your subordinates. And of course, that's not to say that you can ill-treat your subordinates. You shouldn't have any conflict of interest with your suppliers. You shouldn't give any special favors to cozy suppliers. You should not and must not accept or solicit gifts prior to, during, or after any job from your suppliers. Regardless of your personal relationship with the suppliers, you must enforce the plans and specs, which must be definitive and specific, complete from the drawing to the finished product. I've seen with my own eyes, it's a tendency of some contractors to take advantage of their suppliers, to not take advantage of the suppliers. Suppliers should not be required to spend time or furnish material that are not called for in the procurement contract, and do not unduly delay the performance of the supplier or delay the release of payment to the suppliers. It's clear that some of these things look so basic and one would wonder who would do such thing. Precisely, not many people would do that. For those who do it, they're, well, basically the unethical people will do. Having a written code of ethics like this will provide us with a recourse for professional organizations to take any disciplinary action for those who behave unethically. Dealing with clients and employers, this is going to be a big one. For an engineer, an assignment is given by a client or an employer. So when that assignment is given, the engineer shall not accept the assignment unless he or she is competent, competent in terms of education or experience, knowledge, skill, and even time. If you don't have enough time, don't take it. At the same time, recognize her own limitations. And if the job requires some constant field work and you have some knee operation done, you won't be able to do it. There is no point in accepting that assignment, right? So you cannot do it. So don't do it. So you have to accept your limitations and then make amends for it. No matter what, always protect the client's interests. The engineer shall protect client interests, but there is a caveat. He or she should not be bound by what the client wants in cases of unsuccessful assignment. If it is known for sure, of course, who would know it is going to be an unsuccessful assignment? Well, if you are experienced enough, you would know. You should not be bound by what the client wants if the client is dishonest and using deceptive methods, or if the client wants you to resort to unethical means or ends, unhealthy means or ends, unsafe means or ends. In all these cases, be very forthright with the client. An engineer should always preserve the client confidentiality, and no unethical or illegal dissemination of the information is permitted. So you must avoid all conflicts of interest with respect to client, clear or appearance of conflict of interest. Here is something we should pause and think about a little. Sole source of income for a project should be from the client. What does that mean? What it means is that you cannot get double paid for the same work. If you did a design for client X and got paid $10,000, you cannot give the same design to client Y and take another $10,000 from them. Client X already paid you for the same work. So it is unethical to get double paid like that. Here is something that is challenging. If a client rejects your recommendation, what would you do? Clearly, you have to explain the complete consequences of what's going to happen if that recommendation is rejected. If your judgment is overruled by any party, whether it's your client or your superior or anybody that you're associated with on a project, and if it endangers the life or property, then immediately notify their superior, their employer, or client, or proper authorities, if you will, because your social contract is to hold the society's welfare at the highest regard. When a mistake is made, be forthright and fully and openly admit to all errors and then fix those errors. And of course, there is this dictum that your service must be error free. This is not a contradictory dictum here. If you do make a mistake, we are all human, we do make a mistake. What you should do? Be forthright and fully and openly admit all the errors and then fix them. Here are a couple of things that are taken directly from NSPE Code of Ethics. Engineers shall not solicit or accept a contract from a governmental body on which A principal or officer of their organization serves as a member. It speaks for itself. The second one on your screen applies to engineers in public service as members, advisors, employees of a governmental or quasi governmental body or department. It applies to them. Now let's talk about the guidelines in dealing with other engineers, whether they are within your own firm or in a competing firm or across the nation. An engineer should not maliciously attempt to injure the professional reputation or business practice or employment position of other engineers. Here's another interesting thing. Engineers should not review others' work while other engineer is still employed. Say if a client comes to you and asks you to check the work of another engineer, what would you do? If you must, meaning if the client insists that you must, you should make the other person aware of your review. And that's common courtesy. For this rule, let's talk about a specific example. A client hired engineer X to a job, and that job cost $10,000. And engineer X is working on it, and you're also competent in it. And you go to the client and they say, "Look, I'm going to do that for $8,000, and I'll do it better and faster." That is something forbidden in an engineer's code of ethics. So what it reads is this rule states shall not try to replace other engineer while the other engineer received employment or contract with the client. An engineer may not take advantage of the salaried position to compete unfairly. If somebody making $80,000 and moonlights and then undercuts his billing rate below the standard billing rate of in the industry, that is competing unfairly. So whenever you're dealing with other engineers or their work, they're all subject to legal and proprietary restraints. For instance, non-compete agreements and all that you might have signed with other people. If you're working on working with somebody on a proposal together, you cannot just run with that information and bid on your own separately. Or you cannot give that information to other people to give them unfair advantage over who you are working with. And then we as engineers have responsibility for our profession itself. Let's talk what those responsibilities are. One of the first responsibilities is that we must uphold the honor and dignity of the profession. There are a couple of examples by which you can do that. Refrain from self-laudatory advertising. I cannot give an example without picking on some other profession. Well, let me pick on somebody. You have seen some car commercial with all kinds of explosives. Coon's Toyota will not be undersold. Nobody beats the prices of so-and-so Toyota. Or you can also see some of the workers' comp attorneys, they come on with all kinds of gimmickry on the TV with, so we are the best, oh, hire us. Have you ever seen any similar ads by an engineer or an engineering firm? You won't. That's because we are bound by this ethic. Once again, this is common sense. You express opinions only in the areas of their knowledge and expertise. Duh. Should develop public knowledge and appreciation of the engineering profession and its achievement. Well, engineering achievements happen every so frequently. To keep abreast of the latest, not necessarily the greatest, to keep abreast of the latest developments is something that is you owe to the profession. When writing reports or issuing public statements, an engineer shall be objective and truthful in all the professional reports, statements, or testimony, which speaks for itself. And all the relevant information should be included. So imagine a situation where you get paid by an interest group or an activity group, and even if your work is truthful and objective, you have to disclose the fact that it is paid by an interest group or an activist group. So that is very important thing. Issue no statements, criticism, or arguments on technical matters without prefacing on whose behalf they are speaking. And finally, dealing with the public. So public presentations are often going to be part of the job, especially if you are a civil engineer. So whenever you're dealing with public, always act professional and objective. Do not take things personal, especially when you are in a public hearing. Well, a lot of insults will be hurled at you, so you can expect that. That's a problem. So you have to be professional and objective and don't take things personal. No advocacy, no matter what your feelings are about an issue, you do not do an advocacy. You do not take sides without objectively weighing the facts. Once again, if you do make a statement on somebody's behalf, make sure on whose behalf you are making those statements. Remember, public safety and welfare are to be held at the highest regard above any personal gain. We call that as the prime directive, right? Prime directive needs to be upheld. And that's the end of video number 4, and I will see you in video number 5.